The island of Newfoundland keeps its secrets close, shrouds them in mystery. But once in a while, the fog is lifted, the truth comes out.
I get a feeling there's something going on here. My whole body was shaking.
You go to bed believing that you're a certain person one night, and then all of a sudden the next day, everything that you've known is not true.
This is not the life that I should have lived.
I'm Luke Quinton from CBC. This is Come By Chance, available now.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The alarming, but all too predictable thing about today's story is that when I went looking for the clip I'm about to play you, I chose one from February of this year. I could play you a version of this clip from basically every 6 months for the last 5 years. Here it is.
Ocean temperatures hit their highest all-time record in February, a startling milestone that saw the surface of the world's seas hit 69.9 degrees Fahrenheit on average. That's according to the EU's Copernicus Climate Change Service.
Our oceans are in unprecedented amounts of trouble, and we're not doing much to get that under control. We are a long way from net zero, of course, and even if we were on track for that lofty goal, it would take years and years to undo the damage already done. So, we might need to take drastic action. In fact, some people are already taking that action. Not by forcing our governments to end fossil fuel consumption, but to do what humans have always done: engineer our way out of a jam. Can we use science to fix the ocean? Do we understand enough about the world's deep sea ecosystems to try, without messing the whole thing up, even worse than we already have? Regardless of your answer to that question, will we have any choice at some point soon but to try it anyway? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Moira Donovan is a journalist based in Halifax who wrote about the chances of engineering the ocean for the Walrus. Hey, Moira.
Hello.
Why don't you start by taking us back to 2012 and a man named Russ George, who I guess took matters into his own hands a little bit. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, it's funny. This story is so sort of infamous in the space of carbon dioxide removal and marine geoengineering that I have to remind myself sometimes if people don't already know about it. But essentially what happened was that in 2012, Canadian officials became aware that an entrepreneur named Russ George was planning to dump tons of iron sulfate into international waters off the coast of Haida Gwaii. And the idea there was that doing so would both boost fish stocks, so runs of salmon in the area, and would facilitate the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that was done sort of with the support of the Haida Nation at the time, but it definitely did not have the support of Canadian authorities. And so ultimately, that experiment went ahead without Canadian approval and was ultimately condemned in the sort of regulatory spaces that, to some extent, deal with these things.
This is obviously a hot conversation in climate change circles now, but 12 years ago, how new and untested was the stuff that he was doing, and what kind of results, if any, I guess, did it get?
So I guess I should back up a tiny bit and just say that this is considered a form of geoengineering. And geoengineering basically falls into two camps. There's the sort of the way of manipulating the Earth's processes by affecting the sun in some way, so solar geoengineering. And then there's different forms of carbon removal that come from, manipulating those large-scale global systems to affect the Earth's climate. Mm-hmm. And this particular form of geoengineering is called ocean fertilization. It came about in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, when an oceanographer named John Martin put forward what he called the iron hypothesis. So this idea that if you put iron in the ocean, it would facilitate the blooms of phytoplankton, these little tiny organisms that live on the surface of the water. Some of them would sink to the deep part of the ocean where that carbon would then stay sequestered for a long time.
Right.
And famously, in 1988, John Martin sort of half-jokingly said, "Give me half a tanker of iron and I'll give you an ice age."
That's a little bit scary to contemplate.
Yeah, which kind of gets at that idea of unilateral action that I think frightens people a bit with geoengineering.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, that's the sort of pathway by which it works. And Planktos, which was Russ George's company, had proposed doing something like this in the Pacific around the Galapagos in sort of 2007, 2008. And that was widely condemned, and the company abandoned that idea. So it was already sort of on the table, but when it popped up in 2011, 2012, Russ George was operating with a different group at that time. They were calling themselves the Haida Salmon Restoration Corporation. And at that time, it hadn't been tested in this particular way. So it was a new idea.
And they just went ahead and did it without the necessary approval. And what happened?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. So the salmon returns the following year were significantly larger. Alaska reported, sort of the largest salmon returns in some time. And George and others who had supported the project pointed to that as evidence that basically this had worked. But of course, restoring salmon populations was only part of the intention. And the carbon benefits were inconclusive. It wasn't possible to say how much of an impact that it had, sort of facilitating carbon cycling into the deep ocean. George sort of claimed that that's because Canadian officials took his monitoring equipment and he wasn't able to complete the experiment. But yeah, it's not possible to say what an impact that actually made on the climate. And of course, this is way too small of an experiment to actually have a sort of an impact at the climatic scale, even if it had been possible to measure what had happened.
And a dozen years later, the situation with regards to climate is obviously more urgent than we knew about back then. And I guess it's fair to say a lot of this stuff is on the table in a major way. Maybe start with the Canadian company. What is Planetary Technologies and what are they trying to do in this area?
Right. So Planetary Technologies is a Halifax-based company. They're one of many, many companies that have sprung up in the wake of the IPCC saying we're not going to meet 1.5 or even 2 degrees of warming, that particular target, without some form of carbon removal.
Mm-hmm.
So Planetary Technologies, their particular approach is different from what Russ George was doing off the coast of Haida Gwaii. So the idea in this case is that if you dump like an alkaline material, so something like limestone, although in this case it's not limestone, but a material like that into the ocean, that will change the pH of the ocean. And because the atmosphere and the ocean want to stay more or less in equilibrium, changing the pH of the ocean allows it to pull more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that basic pathway is why oceans are acidifying. It's why they're absorbing so much of the excess carbon dioxide already, because as more goes into the atmosphere, the oceans pull more from it. The people who are pursuing this approach, which is called ocean alkalinity enhancement, are sort of saying if you use material to change the pH that can pull more carbon from the atmosphere, it also helps address these issues around ocean acidification, which, are affecting creatures with shells in the ocean and corals and so on and so forth. They have had one trial in Cornwall in the UK, which sort of had an early iteration and is now more or less on hold. And they've also been working in the Halifax Harbour to do some testing of this approach. This year, I believe they'll also be sort of launching a similar trial in Vancouver.
So I find this story and other stories about geoengineering fascinating because there's like such a huge upside and potentially such terrifying downside. So I want to get you, somebody who understands the science of this a little better, sort of make the save the planet case for us. If these tests go well and we can do this safely at scale, how huge is this? How could it potentially change what we're facing?
Well, I think proponents of these approaches are, for the most part, very careful to emphasize that what we need to do first is reduce how much we're emitting.
Sure.
Because even deployed like to the maximum degree, there's only so much these kinds of approaches can do. The kinds of emissions that things like marine geoengineering would help us deal with are the ones that are really hard to abate. Those emissions that even if we were to decarbonize, key sectors of the economy would still exist. And then also maybe to get us back to a point that is safer, both for the planet and for the oceans themselves. Mm-hmm. So I've seen, people who are working on this talk about the fact that we've already overshot or we will soon overshoot what the sort of safe concentration of carbon in the atmosphere is. And so marine geoengineering is kind of one approach that can help reverse the clock on that a little bit. But when you think about scaling, these are really hard things to scale up to a meaningful level. You'd have to have, if you're thinking about something like ocean alkalinity enhancement, so much rock going into the water to have it make sort of a significant difference that we're not talking about continuing current levels of emissions and offsetting that with marine geoengineering. It's really more for those emissions that are going to be very hard to remove from our economies, or at least that's the way it's being sold.
Right, to buy us time as we decarbonize.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, now I would like you to make the case the other way. We are adding all sorts of things in various permutations to an ocean ecosystem that I don't know if we understand fully. Like, how badly could we screw ourselves up here if we do this wrong?
So it's interesting with marine geoengineering because the ocean is such a complex system. We already don't understand it very well.
Right.
For instance, it wasn't that long ago that people thought the so-called mesopelagic zone, the deep part of the ocean, was almost devoid of life. And it's really only in the last couple of decades that people have realized that actually, the largest untapped biomass of fish on the planet lives in that part of the ocean. And there's billions of species down there, or billions of individuals anyway. And so the fact that we don't understand the ocean fully makes it hard to say, I think, conclusively what exactly the impacts would be. And the other thing that makes it hard is that we're talking about approaches that range quite widely.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's things like ocean fertilization, there's, ocean alkalinity enhancement, there's ideas of growing seaweed on the surface and sinking that into the deep ocean. There's, proposals to bring water up from the deep ocean and use that to kind of cycle carbon back down from the atmosphere. It's a really wide range of approaches. And some companies are proposing using multiple ones at the same time. And so parsing out the consequences of that is a little tricky. But if I could sum them up, I would say the idea is that you're changing ecosystems that are potentially quite sensitive, that are already struggling. So, one concern with ocean fertilization, for example, is that you may exacerbate lack of nutrients in another part of the ocean if you're causing a bloom in one area. If you're sinking seaweed into the deep ocean, you might smother the creatures that live down there. Putting, tons of rock dust in the water column. Some people fear that could change the sort of light and nutrient availability. So that would have consequences for critters. There's a range of ecosystem effects that, of course, people are investigating right now.
Right.
If I had to summarize the concern I heard the most is just the idea that we don't yet know how effective any of these are. Because again, we don't understand the underlying complexity of the ocean.
Right.
So if we don't know how effective they are, how can we say that there will be durable carbon sequestration through these approaches? We may be sort of setting ourselves up for having assumed there will be a certain amount of emissions reduction that don't last as long as we think or aren't as effective as we think. We're potentially setting ourselves up for overselling something when the positive outcome isn't as positive as we may have hoped.
Do we have any more traditional methods of trying to do this stuff to the ocean to allow it to pull more carbon or safely store more carbon? And, here I'm just thinking of anti-pollution measures or, I don't even know, growing more coral reefs, whatever's on the table that stops short of messing with something we don't fully understand.
I guess I would say those kind of fall into the categories of what can we not do or what can we stop doing that we're currently doing that's harmful?
Right.
Like coastal ecosystems store a lot of carbon, things like mangroves and salt marshes. If we stop destroying those or maybe restored them, there's, a lot of evidence that that's an effective form of sequestering carbon. There's more evidence that, certain fishing practices release a fair amount of carbon. So things like bottom trawling or even fishing a lot, given what we're increasingly realizing about how much fish themselves represent a form of carbon in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably our understanding of what it looks like to sort of support the natural ways in which the ocean's carbon cycle functions will continue to evolve as we understand more of it. But to some extent, it's sort of leaving things be. I mentioned the fish in the mesopelagic zone. Because they're untapped, some countries are eyeing them as a new fishery, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And there are scientists who are saying we don't know everything, but it's increasingly clear that these fish are keeping a lot of carbon in the ocean and they're helping it cycle. And we shouldn't fish them until we at least understand that better.
Right.
So yeah, I guess, these sort of more gentle approaches that you're mentioning there, I think they sort of involve being a little more hands-off maybe and letting the ocean do its thing.
You mentioned that, Planetary Technologies is one of many companies that have explored this business since we learned, just how dire the situation was and that we might have to manufacture a way out of it. That means there's a ton of money at stake here. So what kind of regulations exist to govern this kind of geoengineering? Can someone pull up and just start dumping stuff into the ocean? What kind of levels of approval are there? It's such a new technology.
It's interesting. So as you mentioned there, the market that these companies are tapping into, the voluntary offset market, is worth billions of dollars, multi-billions of dollars currently, and projected to grow to a much larger size than that. So there is a lot of money on the table. You're already seeing companies have offsets purchased from them. That's despite some of these questions that exist around the sort of effectiveness and the durability of those offsets. Companies like Shopify and Microsoft have bought credits from companies that are testing, including in Canadian waters. And as far as regulations go, it's a fairly unregulated space at the moment. The Canadian government is actively considering what regulations might look like. They're actively considering signing what's called the London Convention, London Protocol, which are a sort of a pair of treaties that deal with marine dumping. And, in the wake of what happened in 2012, those do explicitly deal with ocean fertilization. But there's an amendment that hasn't yet been ratified by enough countries to be legally binding, and Canada is one of the countries that hasn't signed. But it's complicated because, marine geoengineering it's not fully obvious that it's a form of marine dumping or even that it should be treated that way. And so I think there's a lot of overlapping rules and jurisdictions that come into this. And there's currently no one piece of legislation or set of regulations that deal with it. And that's certainly the concern for some people who are operating in this space or who are sort of analyzing it, that without an adequate set of regulations, there could be harmful practices that could go on, especially because the ocean is this sort of, it's already in many ways a pretty unregulated space, especially as you get into the high seas. So there's the potential for abuse there as we figure out what those regulations look like.
So far, we've talked a lot about, testing and trying to understand the ecosystems that we're messing with. But there's also an incredibly urgent problem out there that is, hitting us now with impacts that I think some scientists predicted we would see maybe 10 or more years from now. Will there come a point where we just have to roll the dice with something like this, whether it's, one of these technologies or something else? I know we've done an episode in the past about trying to filter out sunlight from entering the atmosphere. At some point, we're just going to have to do something and hope it works, right?
Yeah, that's definitely the concern. And it's interesting because when I was talking to people for the story, it came up that folks were hearing in some of the meetings they were going to, including the most recent COP, people sort of reversing the precautionary principle. This idea that, you proceed with the utmost caution when conducting scientific work like this or looking at modifying a system. People saying the most cautious thing we can do is to act now because the effects on ecosystems from climate change are already so severe. Like I live in Nova Scotia, we had an insane marine heat wave last summer, like many places, and like everywhere else in the country, we're experiencing both the terrestrial and, of course, also the marine effects of climate change. So the concern certainly is that either an individual like Russ George or a state or a company could sort of choose to act unilaterally, or that we may be forced to enact and put in place technologies and practices that we don't fully understand just because the effects of climate change seem so severe. But I think that's a point that many, many people operating in the space and scientists certainly don't want us to get to.
Right.
To paint ourselves into a corner where we have to use these, even though there may be all kinds of consequences that we don't understand.
Well, this is my last question then. On the one hand, it's amazing that we can do things like this and might perhaps maybe be able to engineer our way out of some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. On the other hand, dystopian novels start this way. In reporting this story, when you came out of it, did you end up feeling more hopeful or scared or what?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the reason I had started looking into this is because I had seen a lot of reporting on the fact that these companies were getting set up. And most of that reporting was just sort of straightforwardly talking about the climate solution angle of it, which is great. I mean, I'm all for climate solutions. But it just struck me that it's much more complicated than that. And I think that's where I ended at the end of my reporting too. I don't know if it's possible to come down one way or another on them at the moment because they are experimental. They are tinkering with a system that is very complicated and that we need to support life on this planet. And there are definitely concerning dynamics present in the sort of profit motive that has crept into this, which I think we need to be really careful around. And, to look at the claims that are being made with these technologies with a heavy dose of skepticism as a result. But there's also this massive unregulated experiment that we're conducting on the ocean right now. And that is having extremely severe consequences. And to proceed as we're doing now is also threatening, both the health of that ecosystem and everything that lives in it, and then also ultimately us. Like many of the people I talked to, I think where I ended up was it's worth considering what these might look like. And it's certainly worth doing the science. But we should be very cautious about any claims that are made about how effective they are, how easily they can be scaled up, how much of a difference this could make. And also, any claims that don't involve sort of everyone who has a say in that, which is ultimately everyone on the planet.
Moira, thank you so much for this. I was hoping you would tell me this was a magic solution, but it's better to understand everything about it instead. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Moira Donovan, writing in The Walrus. That was The Big Story. For more from us, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. Lots of horrifying climate change stories are there, just waiting for you to anxiously listen to them. If you want to offer us feedback or a suggestion for another climate change story, you can do it by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or you can call us and leave a voicemail 416-935-5935. Joe Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is also a producer. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our audience development lead. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. And our sound design, handled by an amazing team of Robin Edgar, Christy Chan, Christian Prohome, and Mark Angley. The Big Story is part of Frequency Podcast Network, which makes us a division of Rogers. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. Enjoy your holiday weekend. We'll have, as usual, a couple of treats for you in the feed, and The Big Story will return on Tuesday, July 2nd.